I was wiping blood off the throne when I understood. Not my blood. Never mine. I'd learned young that survival meant being invisible while everyone else bled. The vampire king sat 3 feet away, watching me clean the evidence of what his brother had done. Again. He didn't see me, not really. I was the gardener's daughter. The girl who'd been there so long she'd become part of the furniture. Useful. Loyal. Beneath notice. What he didn't know was that I'd spent 6 years unraveling the conspiracy that murdered his parents. That every traitor who'd mysteriously disappeared, every alliance that quietly fractured, every careful move that kept his kingdom from imploding, all of it had been me. He thought I was beneath him. He had no idea I was the only reason he still had a kingdom to rule. If you've ever been the one holding everything together while someone else got the credit, maybe you'll understand why I stayed as long as I did. And maybe you'll understand why, when he finally pushed me out, I let the whole thing burn. There are other women like this. Women who've realized that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is walk away from something you've been carrying alone. If that recognition lands somewhere in your chest, there are more stories like this one. But they're easy to lose if you're not paying attention. My name is Fatima. And this is how I learned that being essential doesn't mean you're valued. My father used to say the palace gardens could survive anything except neglect. He'd say it while his hands worked soil that had fed vampire royalty for 200 years, while I sat cross-legged beside him, learning which roses needed shade and which ones craved the merciless sun. I was 12 when I learned he was wrong. Gardens can survive neglect. What they can't survive is fire. The night the coup came, I was in the West Garden with Aiden and Jaden, the twin sons of King Sharon and Queen Selena. We'd been there since sunset, the 3 of us sprawled on the grass, talking about nothing important the way children do when they don't yet understand that some nights divide your life into before and after. Aiden was teaching me the constellations. Jaden was complaining that no one cared about dead stars. Then the screaming started. I remember Aiden grabbing my hand. Remember Jaden going very still, his head tilted like he was listening to something only he could hear. Remember my father appearing from nowhere, moving faster than I'd ever seen him move, his face carved from terror I didn't understand. "Run," he said, and his voice didn't sound like my father anymore. "Fatima, take them to the old greenhouse. Stay there. Don't come out until I come for you." "Papa, what's?" "Go." I went. Not because I understood. Because the look in his eyes told me that questions were a luxury we didn't have anymore. The greenhouse was on the eastern edge of the estate, past the hedge maze and the reflecting pool. I pulled both boys through the dark, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Behind us, the palace lit up like a second sun. Orange and gold, and the sick smell of something burning that wasn't supposed to burn. Inside the greenhouse, pressed between pots of night-blooming jasmine and climbing roses my father had been training for the Queen's solarium, we waited. Aiden kept his hand in mine. His was cold. Mine was shaking. Jaden stood apart, watching the palace through the glass panes with an expression I couldn't read. "My mother's in there," Aiden whispered. "My father." "They'll be fine," I said, because I was 12 and still believed that saying something made it true. "My papa's with them. He'll keep them safe." Jaden said nothing. "Just watch the smoke rise." We waited for 3 hours. Or maybe it was 3 minutes. Time had stopped working properly. When the greenhouse door finally opened, it wasn't my father. It was Brennan, one of the palace guards, or someone who used to be palace guard before tonight rewrote everything. His armor was gone. His face was ash pale except where blood had dried in lines down his neck. "Your Highnesses," he said, and even his voice sounded burned. "We have to move. Now." "Where's my father?" Aiden asked, and something in Brennan's face made my chest go tight. "Where's the king?" Jaden demanded. "Where are our parents?" Brennan looked at them, looked at me, and I knew. You always know before the words come. "I'm sorry," he said. Aiden made a sound like something breaking. Jaden's face went blank. And I understood, with the terrible clarity children sometimes have, that the world had just ended and somehow kept going anyway. "And my papa?" My voice came out smaller than I meant it to. Where's my father? Brennan's expression shifted into something that might have been pity. He gave his life protecting the princes. He held the eastern corridor long enough for us to get them out.
He stopped.
Started again. He died a hero, child. A hero. My father, who taught me about roses and patience and the proper way to prune lavender so it would come back stronger. Who sang off-key while he worked. Who called me his little seed because I was growing into something he couldn't predict but was proud of anyway.
Dead.
Protecting someone else's children while I hid in his greenhouse. I don't remember most of what happened next. My brain must have decided that some things were too big to hold all at once. I remember walking, remember smoke and ash, and the way the palace looked like a ribcage picked clean. Remember arriving somewhere that smelled like old stone and new blood. The usurpers, that's what I learned to call them later, once I had words for what had happened, took the throne room like they'd been invited. Like murder was just aggressive negotiation. King Sharon and Queen Selena were dead. My father was dead. Most of the royal guard was dead. And the vampires who'd done it sat on a throne that wasn't theirs and called it justice for old wrongs I was too young to understand. They let Aiden and Jaden live. Not out of mercy. Vampires don't do mercy. But because killing royal children would have fractured the kingdom beyond repair, and even usurpers need something left to rule. They let me live because I didn't matter enough to kill. The gardener's daughter. Harmless. Beneath notice. I learned quickly what that meant. I wasn't family anymore. Wasn't the little girl who'd been welcomed in the palace corridors, who'd eaten at the same table as princes, who'd been loved by a queen who never had a daughter of her own. I was staff. Lower than staff. A reminder of the old regime that the new rulers wanted erased, but couldn't quite justify murdering. Aiden tried, at first, to maintain what we'd been. He'd find me in the halls, ask how I was, talk to me like we were still the children who'd sprawled in gardens together. But his warmth was residual. Habit. The ghost of something that couldn't survive in the palace's new climate. Jaden didn't even bother with ghosts. He looked at me like I was complicit somehow. Like my father's sacrifice had been a choice that left him orphaned when it should have been different. He never said it outright. He didn't have to. You can feel contempt without it being named. I learned to disappear. Learned which hallways to avoid and which corners would hide me when the court got dangerous. Learned to move through the palace like furniture. Useful, invisible, expected. Learned that the only way to survive losing everything was to become nothing at all. But at night, alone in the small room they'd given me near the service quarters, so far from the chambers I'd once played in that it felt like exile, I made myself a promise. My father died believing his sacrifice mattered. Believing he'd saved something worth saving. I would make sure he was right. I didn't know then that it would take 6 years. Didn't know that justice would look less like a moment and more like erosion, patient, relentless, invisible. Didn't know that the boy who'd held my hand in the greenhouse would one day be the man I'd have to walk away from. All I knew was that the palace was full of people who'd stolen a throne built on bodies. And somewhere in the ash of that burning night, I'd stopped being the gardener's daughter. I'd become something else entirely. Something they'd never see coming until it was far too late. 6 years is long enough to forget what your own voice sounds like when you're angry. I was 24 when I finally remembered. The palace had taught me 100 ways to be useful. I knew which council members took bribes and which ones took offense. Knew how to mediate territory disputes between vampire families who'd been feuding since before my country existed. Knew the exact tone to use when suggesting a course of action to Aiden. Deferential enough that he'd think it was his idea, confident enough that he'd actually listen. I'd become exactly what they needed me to be. The invisible administrator. The one who made things work without anyone noticing the machinery. Aiden had grown into the throne the way you grow into a scar, slowly, painfully, leaving him shaped wrong in places that would never quite heal. He relied on me without knowing he was relying on me. Would call me to his study late at night when the weight of inherited guilt got too heavy, when the crown his parents died for felt more like a noose than a birthright. "At least you're here, Fatima," he'd say, like I was a comfort. A constant. "Some things stay the same." I'd smile.
Nod.
Make myself smaller, so his grief had more room. And I'd hate myself a little more each time. Jaden had grown into something else entirely. Resentment carved into a face that looked too much like his mother's for anyone to bear looking at directly. He moved through the court like he was owed something no one could name. The throne sat in his brother's chambers, but the bitterness lived in Jaden's eyes, sharp and ancient, and getting sharper every year. I'd learned to avoid him, learned that his contempt was less dangerous when I stayed beneath his notice. But that night, the night everything fractured open, I wasn't trying to hear anything. I was just trying to survive another evening of being invisible while everyone else got to be real. I'd been in the old archive room, reorganizing trade agreements because someone had to and no one else cared enough to notice they were filed wrong. It was past midnight. The palace was that specific kind of quiet that only comes when vampires think they're alone, when they forget that mortal heartbeats are easy to overlook. That's when I heard voices drifting up through the ventilation shaft. The archive room sat directly above the old council chamber, the one they never used anymore because it was too far from the throne room, too isolated, too easy to have conversations you didn't want overheard. I should have left, should have gathered my papers, and disappeared the way I'd been taught. But I heard Jaden's voice, and something in it, something raw and undisguised, made me freeze. Waited long enough. His words came up through the grate like smoke. 6 years of watching him pretend to be king. 6 years of everyone acting like he earned what should have been mine. Your Highness, patience is served. That was Rowan Vetch, one of the coup families. Old vampire money, the kind that had thrived under the usurper's rule. Patience. Jaden's laugh was broken glass. I orchestrated the whole thing. I gave you my parents. I handed you the throne on a night soaked in blood, and you're telling me about patience. The archive room tilted. Or maybe it was me. Maybe it was the world, finally admitting what it had always been. It was always supposed to be mine, Jaden continued, and I could hear him pacing now. Could picture him wearing down the stone floor with centuries of accumulated rage. They loved him more. Everyone saw it.
The heir.
The chosen one. The twin who got their attention while I got their afterthoughts. So I made sure he'd inherit ashes. Made sure they'd die knowing their favorite son would rule over ruins. And he does, Rowan said carefully. The kingdom is fractured, weakened. But still his. Still his throne, his title, his crown. The rage in Jaden's voice was a living thing. While I'm what? The spare? The shadow? The one who did what needed doing but gets none of the glory. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the floor, trying to hold something still when everything was breaking. My father died protecting this man. Died believing he was saving something worth saving. Died thinking the coup was external, foreign, preventable. Died not knowing one of the boys he'd raised had been the architect of his own parents' murder. What do you propose? Rowan asked. Time, Jaden said. Let the kingdom fracture further. Let my brother drown in the weight of a crown he never wanted. And when he's weak enough, when the cord is desperate enough. He paused. Then we take what was always mine. I stopped hearing after that. Stopped processing. My body was still in the archive room, but my mind was somewhere else. Somewhere 6 years in the past, watching my father die for a lie. I could have run to Aiden. Could have dragged him to the council chamber. Forced him to hear what I'd heard. But I'd lived in this palace long enough to know how that story ended. The gardener's daughter accusing the prince? They'd call it grief, madness, desperate attention-seeking. They'd exile me if I was lucky. Kill me if I wasn't. And Jaden would remain untouched.
No.
If I was going to honor my father's sacrifice, if I was going to make his death mean something, I couldn't do it by begging to be believed. I had to make them see without ever knowing I was the one opening their eyes. That night, I started making lists. Not on paper, paper could be found. In my head, where only I could access them. Every family that had benefited from the coup. Every alliance Jaden had forged. Every piece of the conspiracy he'd built. I studied vampire politics the way I'd once studied my father's gardens, looking for weak points, for what needed pruning, for what would wither if you cut off its root system. I made myself even more indispensable. Took on more duties, more access, more trust. Became the person they couldn't imagine the palace functioning without. And I waited. 3 months later, Rowan Vetch died in a carriage accident on his way back from the summer estates. Such a tragedy, everyone said. He'd survived 4 centuries only to be taken by something as mundane as a broken axle on a mountain road. No one suspected the axle had been weakened days before. No one thought to ask who'd suggested that particular route, who'd mentioned the roads were so much better maintained on the Eastern Pass. No one looked at the gardener's daughter, still invisible, still useful, still beneath their notice. I stood at his funeral and felt nothing except the first spark of something I hadn't felt since I was 12 years old. Purpose. Justice doesn't always look like a trial. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like a woman who's learned exactly how to make powerful men disappear while everyone's looking the other way. My father died believing his sacrifice mattered. I was going to make sure he was right, even if it took me 6 more years. Even if it meant becoming something he never could have imagined. I learned something that night in the archive room, listening to Jaden confess to murdering the people who'd loved him. Power doesn't need to be seen to be absolute. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in a room is the one nobody's looking at. And nobody was looking at me. Not yet. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but that's not quite right. Revenge isn't cold. It's patient. It's waking up every morning and choosing the long way around. It's smiling at people who should be afraid of you while they mistake your silence for submission. It took me 4 years to dismantle what Jaden had spent a decade building. For years of being so useful, so indispensable, so perfectly invisible that no one thought to question why certain families suddenly lost their fortunes, their influence, their lives. The Harrow clan fell first after Rowan. Old money, vampire aristocracy, who'd funded the coup in exchange for territory rights they'd been denied under King Karen's rule. Their estate burned, faulty wiring, the investigators said. Ancient places like that, you never could trust the infrastructure. All 7 family members died in their sleep, including the children. I didn't feel guilty about the children. I'd stopped being able to afford guilt somewhere around here too. Then the Strand family. Then the Cove Syndicate. Then Isla Morant, who'd personally stood guard while assassins murdered the Queen. She disappeared on a diplomatic mission to the Western Territories. They found her 3 months later, drained and left in a ravine. Tragic, everyone agreed. You can't trust those Western covens. I could have told them exactly which Western coven to blame, the one I'd carefully negotiated with, the one who owed me favors I'd accumulated by solving their succession crisis. But no one asked the gardener's daughter about vampire politics. The court stabilized in ways it hadn't since before the coup. Trade agreements I drafted got signed. Territory disputes I mediated stayed mediated. The kingdom started functioning like a kingdom again instead of a fractured empire held together by threat and grievance. Everyone credited Aiden. The young king finally coming into his own, they said. Finally showing the strength his father had. And he believed them. I'd watch him in council meetings, presenting strategies I'd spent weeks developing, speaking words I'd carefully fed him over late-night conversations in his study. He'd deliver them like they were his own insights, his own brilliance. And the court would nod, impressed, never seeing the architecture behind the performance. "You're doing well," I told him once, after a particularly successful negotiation with the Northern Territories. He'd smiled, tired but genuine. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Fatima. You keep things running while I figure out how to be what they need." What they need. Not what I'd built. Not what I'd bled for. What they need. I should have left then. Should have recognized that no amount of essential would ever translate to valued. But I didn't. Because I still had work to do. Because Jaden still breathed. Because my father's sacrifice still demanded completion. And maybe, God, maybe, because some part of me still hoped Aiden would finally see me. Jaden, though. Jaden was starting to notice something wrong. I'd catch him watching me sometimes, his eyes narrow with suspicion he couldn't quite articulate. He'd started asking questions in council meetings, pushing back on decisions that seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed. Interesting how the families who opposed my brother's rule keep meeting unfortunate ends, he said one evening, his voice casual, but his gaze sharp as broken glass. The council chamber went very quiet. Unfortunate, Aiden agreed carefully. But unrelated. Isla's death was Western Territory violence. The Harrow fire was investigated thoroughly. By investigators we appointed, Jaden interrupted. Don't you think that's convenient? I kept my eyes on my notes, my hands steady. Just the administrator. Just the furniture. What are you suggesting? Aiden's voice had gone cold. I'm suggesting that someone is cleaning house. Someone patient enough to make it look like accidents. Smart enough to know exactly which families to target. Jaden's eyes swept the room, landing on me for just a moment too long. Someone who's been here the whole time, watching everything. My heart was a war drum. But I'd spent years learning to keep my face empty. If you're implying there's a conspiracy within the court, Aiden started. I'm implying we should pay attention to who benefits from our enemies dying. We benefit, Aiden said flatly. The kingdom benefits. Or would you prefer we were still navigating the chaos the coup families created? Jaden said nothing. Just kept watching. Kept suspecting. Kept being unable to prove what he sensed. That somewhere in his carefully constructed conspiracy, someone was pulling threads he couldn't see. That night, Aiden called me to his study. It was late. He looked exhausted, the weight of the crown leaving shadows under his eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Do you think Jaden's right? He asked. About someone removing opposition? I could have told him. Could have laid it all out. The evidence I'd been gathering. The truth about his brother. The 6 years I'd spent dismantling a conspiracy from within. I think grief makes people see patterns that aren't there, I said instead. Your brother lost his parents too. Maybe he needs someone to blame besides the randomness of tragedy. Aiden exhaled, some tension leaving his shoulders. You're probably right. You usually are. He smiled, that tired, grateful smile that used to make me feel seen. At least you're here, Fatima. Some things stay the same.
Some things stay the same.
I walked back to my chambers through corridors I'd memorized in the dark. Past rooms I'd cleaned and organized and managed. Through a palace I'd saved while pretending I was just keeping it tidy. And I finally understood. He didn't see me. Not really. I was constancy, comfort, the familiar face that made the palace feel less empty. I was furniture that had the advantage of being able to talk, to solve problems, to make his life easier. But I wasn't a person. Not someone with my own rage, my own grief, my own carefully constructed war. I was just Fatima, the gardener's daughter, the one who'd always been there, the one who always would be. That night, I opened the locked trunk beneath my bed, the one I'd told everyone held my father's belongings, too precious to throw away, too painful to look at often. Inside were 6 years of documentation. Letters copied. Witnesses compelled to record their testimony. Financial records tracing money from Jaden to the families he'd conspired with. A pattern so clear, so irrefutable, that even willful blindness couldn't deny it. Everything I needed to expose him. To deliver the justice my father's death demanded. Only one piece remained. Jaden himself. I'd saved him for last. Not out of mercy, but because I needed to remove every ally, every protection, every escape route first. Needed him isolated before I struck. Now he was. And I was ready. I thought, after 6 years of being indispensable, that Aiden would finally see me when I showed him what I'd done. That he'd understand I hadn't been furniture. I'd been saving his kingdom while he'd been drowning in inherited guilt. I thought if I was essential enough, patient enough, useful enough, he'd finally recognize that the woman who'd held everything together deserved to be more than a comfort he took for granted. I was wrong. I'd spent so long learning how to be invisible that I'd forgotten the most important lesson. People can't value what they don't see. And he'd stopped seeing me years ago. The council meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock. I had everything prepared. The documents arranged in chronological order, the witness testimonies transcribed and verified, the financial records that traced blood money from Jaden's accounts to the families who'd slit his parents' throats. 6 years of work laid out like a prosecution that couldn't be denied. I was in the East Wing archive room, the one I'd converted into something else over the years, somewhere between evidence locker and shrine to my father's sacrifice. No one came here anymore. The space was mine by virtue of being too tedious for anyone else to care about.
That's what I thought, anyway.
What is this? Aiden's voice hit me like cold water. I turned to find him in the doorway, holding one of the ledgers I'd left on the table. His face was pale in that specific way vampires get when they're genuinely shaken. Not fear, but the recognition that something fundamental just shifted. How did you? Brennan mentioned you'd been spending time here. I thought maybe you needed help with the archival project. His eyes swept the room, taking in the walls I'd covered with documentation, the careful organization of evidence, the timeline I'd constructed with string and pins like something from a detective's fever dream. Fatima, what is this? I could have lied. Should have, maybe. But I was so tired of lying. So tired of being invisible while the truth suffocated me. The truth about your brother, I said quietly. About who killed your parents. The ledger slipped from his fingers. He didn't pick it up. I've known for 6 years, I continued, my voice steadier than I felt. I overheard Jaden confessing to Rowan Vetch. He orchestrated the coup. His jealousy, his resentment, he gave them your parents, Aiden. He murdered them and blamed it on foreign enemies, so he could. Stop. The word came out strangled. You can't, this isn't. It's real. I picked up the ledger, held it out to him. This is money he paid to the Harrow clan 3 weeks before the coup. This is a letter from Isla Morant confirming the plan. This is testimony from... I don't want to see it. The words hung between us like something dying. You don't want to, I stopped. Started again. Aiden, your brother killed your parents. My father died protecting you from a conspiracy Jaden created. Don't you want? Want? His laugh was broken. What I want doesn't matter. What I want is for my parents to be alive. What I want is for none of this to have happened. What I want is, he pressed his palms against his eyes. How long have you been planning this? Planning what? This. He gestured at the room, exposing him. The council meeting you scheduled for this afternoon. Don't think I didn't notice. You're going to present this, aren't you? You're going to force me to execute my own brother. The way he said it, like I was the one doing something unforgivable. He murdered your parents, I said, hearing my voice crack. He murdered my father. He deserves justice? Is that what you call this? Aiden moved into the room, his movement sharp with something between panic and rage. You've been lying to me for 6 years. Playing some kind of long game while I trusted you. He stopped, jaw tight. God, Fatima. What have you become? What have I become? 6 years of holding his kingdom together. 6 years of eliminating the conspirators who would have torn everything apart. 6 years of protecting him from threats he never saw because I made sure he never had to. And he was asking what I'd become. I became what was necessary, I said. Each word felt like pulling glass from a wound. While you mourned, I worked. While you carried guilt, I carried this palace. I've spent 6 years saving everything your parents built, everything my father died for. And now, when I'm finally ready to finish what I started, I can't let you do this. The room went very still. You can't. I couldn't finish.
Couldn't breathe.
If you expose Jaden, the kingdom will fracture. The family's still loyal to him, and there's some, whether you've eliminated them all or not, they'll see it as fratricide. As me killing my own blood to consolidate power. It'll look exactly like what the coup families did to my father. His voice was desperate now, pleading. Don't you see? If I become the kind of king who executes his own brother, I become what I hate. I become them. He killed your parents. I know. The admission came out like something dying. I know. But he's all I have left, Fatima. He's the last piece of my family. The last person who remembers our mother's laugh, our father's. His voice broke. If I kill him, I'm alone. You're protecting him. I heard myself say it. Heard the disbelief, making my voice high and strange. After everything I've shown you, After 6 years of. After 6 years of lying to me, of eliminating people without my knowledge, of playing vigilante while I thought you were just, he stopped. We both knew what he'd thought I was. Just Fatima. Just the help. Just the furniture that kept the palace running. I've held this kingdom together. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the table to hide it. Every alliance you've celebrated, every treaty you've signed, every moment of stability you've taken credit for. That was me. I did that. While you were drowning in guilt, while you were too busy mourning to see what was breaking, I kept everything from falling apart. I didn't ask you to do that. The words landed like a physical blow. You didn't have to ask, I whispered. I did it because my father died believing his sacrifice mattered. I did it because I thought I stopped. Couldn't finish. Because I thought you'd see me. Because I thought if I was essential enough, indispensable enough, you'd finally understand that I wasn't furniture. That I was the reason you still had something to rule. Fatima, if you love me, Aiden started. Don't. The word came out sharp. Don't you dare tell me this is about love. If you ever cared about this family, about what my parents meant to you, you'll let this go. His voice was soft now, almost gentle. Like he was trying to comfort me while he destroyed everything. Please. I'm begging you. Don't make me choose between justice and becoming a monster. He's the monster, I said. But even I could hear how weak it sounded. Then I'm choosing not to become him. Aiden straightened, and I watched the king replace the man. Watched him pull on the crown like armor. I'm sorry, Fatima. But I can't let you do this. I won't. The council meeting was in 2 hours. He'd cancel it. Would make sure I never got the chance to present what I'd found. Would protect his brother, his parents' murderer, my father's killer, because mercy felt safer than justice. After everything I've done. My voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. After 6 years of holding your kingdom together while you took credit for ruling it, you're choosing him. I'm choosing not to become a kinslayer, he said. Can you understand that? I understood perfectly. The man I'd protected for years, the boy I'd pulled through burning gardens, the king I'd made by carefully shaping every decision he thought was his own, was protecting his parents' murderer. And I was the threat. Not Jaden, who'd orchestrated a coup that killed everyone we'd loved.
Me.
Because I dared to believe that justice mattered more than comfort. That truth mattered more than the illusion of family. Get out, I said quietly. Fatima. Get out of my evidence room. Get out of my work. Get out of the 6 years I spent saving you. My voice was shaking now, all the control I'd learned crumbling. You think I'm the one who's become something unrecognizable? Look at yourself. You're choosing the man who murdered your parents because you're too afraid to be alone. He left without another word. And I stood in that room full of proof that would never matter, surrounded by 6 years of invisible work that would never be seen, and finally understood the truth. Being essential doesn't mean being valued. It just means you're useful until the moment you're not. The decree came at dawn. Not publicly. Aiden had at least that much mercy, or maybe it was just cowardice dressed up as kindness. For your safety, he said, standing in the doorway of my chambers like he was afraid to come closer. Like I might contaminate him with whatever I'd become. The court is asking questions about the evidence room. Jaden knows someone's been working against him. If you stay, I can't protect you. I was packing already. Had been since he'd left the archive room yesterday. I'd spent 6 years learning to read situations, to anticipate outcomes. I knew what was coming the moment he chose his brother over the truth. You mean you won't protect me? I said, folding clothes I'd worn while keeping his kingdom from imploding. There's a difference. Fatima. Don't. I didn't look at him.
Couldn't.
You're not doing this for my safety. You're doing it because you're terrified I'll expose him anyway. That I'll stand up in council and show everyone what you're too afraid to see.
So you're removing me.
Quietly. Efficiently. I smiled without humor. I taught you well. The silence stretched long enough to hurt. I wish you could understand, he said finally. I wish you could see that I'm trying to prevent more bloodshed. That I'm trying to be better than. Than what? Than the truth. I turned to face him then, and watched him flinch at whatever he saw in my expression. You're not being better, Aiden. You're being safe. And there's nothing noble about that. The palace will arrange transport. I don't want anything from the palace. Each word came out clean, sharp. I don't want your money or your guilt or your assurance that this is somehow for my own good. I want nothing from you except the thing you've never been capable of giving me. What's that? The truth that I mattered. He left without answering. Maybe because there wasn't an answer that wouldn't damn him. The court barely noticed my departure. The gardener's daughter, leaving after all these years, it was almost poetic, they probably thought. Full circle. Back to wherever people like me belonged when we'd outlived our usefulness. I walked through the palace one last time, and it was like walking through a museum of my own ghost. The East Wing, where I'd mediated the Thornvescovo alliance that would have erupted into territorial war without the exact phrasing I'd suggested. They'd attributed it to Aiden's diplomatic instincts. He'd never known I'd spent 3 weeks negotiating behind the scenes, finding the compromise that let both families save face. The council chamber, where trade agreements I drafted in careful legalese sat filed under Aiden's seal. Economic policies that had stabilized the kingdom's fractured finances after the coup families had bled the treasury dry. Everyone praised the young king's acumen. No one asked who'd actually written the words. The throne room, where I'd scrubbed blood more times than I could count. Not always from violence, sometimes from ceremonies, from rituals, from the small cuts that vampire culture demanded. But I'd cleaned them all. Made the stone shine like the kingdom wasn't built on bodies. I should have felt something. Rage, maybe.
Grief.
The bitter satisfaction of watching them realize too late what they'd lost. But I felt nothing. 6 years of invisible labor, and I'd finally perfected disappearing. I'd made myself so good at being unseen that even I couldn't find the woman I used to be.
No one stopped me at the gates.
No one asked if I needed anything, where I was going, if I'd be back. I was already forgotten. I found a small apartment in Brooklyn, 3 floors up in a brownstone that had probably been beautiful once. It was nothing like the palace, small, human-scaled, ordinary. I could hear neighbors through the walls. Could smell someone cooking dinner. Could walk to a corner store and buy coffee without anyone bowing or averting their eyes. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like amputation. I'd cut off 6 years of my life and left them bleeding on palace floors, and now I was supposed to just, what? Exist? Pretend I was the same person who'd entered that palace at 18? I wasn't. I'd become something else. Something sharp and efficient, and so good at being useful that I'd forgotten how to be anything else. 3 months passed. I didn't watch the news. Didn't follow vampire politics. Didn't let myself wonder if Aiden was managing without me. But then Brennan showed up. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him. Older somehow, though vampires don't age. Worn down by something internal. The kingdom is fracturing, he said, standing in my tiny apartment like he'd brought the palace with him. The Thornvescovo alliance collapsed. They're 2 weeks from open warfare. The trade agreements with the southern territories fell apart. Turns out there were clauses that needed annual renewal, and no one knew, except you, apparently. The treasury's hemorrhaging money because Aiden approved spending he didn't understand. And Jaden, he stopped. Jaden's positioning himself. Gathering support. Everyone can see it except the king. Then tell him, I said. I did. He doesn't know how to fix it. None of us do. Brennan's eyes met mine. You built infrastructure we didn't even know existed. And now that you're gone, it's crumbling. Good. The word came out flat. Empty. Brennan stared. You don't mean that. Don't I? I turned away, looked out the window at a city that didn't need me, didn't know me, wouldn't miss me if I disappeared. I spent 6 years holding that kingdom together. 6 years of invisible work while everyone took credit. And when I finally asked for the one thing I'd earned, justice for my father, I was cast out. So yes, Brennan. Let it crumble. Let them finally understand what they lost. People will die. People already died. My father died. King Sharon and Queen Selena died. Everyone who believed that palace stood for something more than power and pride, they all died. And I'm supposed to care that the kingdom's inconvenience now. I laughed and it sounded like breaking. I was holding everything together. And no one even noticed. Brennan left. But he planted something I couldn't quite dig out. Because somewhere in that fracturing kingdom, Aiden was drowning. Was finding my notes in the archives, the careful strategies I'd documented, the infrastructure I'd built while he thought he was ruling. Was finally seeing the invisible architecture that had kept his throne stable. Was understanding, too late, what he'd cast out. And Jaden, clever, bitter Jaden, was sensing weakness the way predators sense blood. Was making his move, gathering the support I'd spent years dismantling. Was positioning himself for the throne he'd murdered to claim. I thought I'd feel satisfaction, vindication, the bitter pleasure of being proven right. But I felt nothing. The kingdom I'd saved for 6 years was crumbling. And I couldn't bring myself to care. Maybe that was the cruelest thing of all. That Aiden had been right to be afraid of what I'd become. Not a monster. Something worse. Someone who'd learned that being essential doesn't mean being valued. That sacrifice doesn't guarantee gratitude. That you can pour 6 years of your life into saving people who will choose comfort over truth every single time. I'd become someone who could watch the world burn and feel nothing but the ghost of a girl who once believed that doing the right thing mattered. That girl was gone. And I didn't even know how to mourn her. He came on a Thursday in February, when Brooklyn was gray and cold, and I'd almost convinced myself I was building something that looked like a life. I heard the knock, and knew before I opened the door. You don't spend 6 years learning someone's patterns, and then forget the exact rhythm they use when they're trying not to seem desperate. Aiden looked like he'd aged a decade in 4 months. Vampires don't age, but grief does something to them anyway. Hollows them out, makes them look like beautiful ruins. No, I said, before he could speak. You don't know what I'm going to. I know exactly what you're going to ask. And the answer is no. I started to close the door. His hand caught it, not forceful, just present. A question instead of a demand.
Please.
Just let me. Let you what? Explain how the kingdom's falling apart? How Jaden's making his move and you don't know how to stop him. How every system I built is crumbling because no one else knew it existed. I met his eyes. I already know, Aiden. Brennan came months ago. And I said no then too. Everything you worked for. Everything I worked for was never mine. The words came out quiet, but they landed like stones. It was always yours. Your kingdom. Your credit. Your throne. I was just the invisible labor that made it all function. So let it fall. Let it break. It was never mine to save. He flinched like I'd struck him. I was wrong. I know you were. I don't think you do. He pushed past me, not aggressive, just desperate, and stood in my small apartment like he'd brought the weight of the palace with him. I found your notes. All of them. The strategies, the negotiations, the careful documentation of every disaster you prevented. I spent 3 weeks reading through 6 years of work I took credit for. Work I thought was mine. His voice cracked. You weren't just helping me rule. You were ruling. And I never saw it.
No.
You didn't. I closed the door. Not to keep him in, but to keep the neighbors from hearing whatever this was becoming. You saw furniture. You saw constancy. You saw the gardener's daughter, who'd always been there, and always would be. You weren't beneath me. He said it like a confession, like something dying. You were holding me up. You were the foundation, the architecture, the only thing keeping the throne from destroying itself. And I cast you out because I was too afraid to see it. Because I asked you to choose between comfort and truth. I corrected. Because I dared to suggest that justice mattered more than your guilt. I was protecting the wrong person. The admission came hard. I thought I was preventing bloodshed. Thought I was being better than the coup families who killed for power. But I was just protecting my brother, my parents' murder, because being alone was more terrifying than being wrong. I wanted the words to feel like victory, like vindication. But they just felt tired. And it took losing me to realize that. Yes. No hesitation. No excuses. It took watching everything you built crumble. Took Jaden making his move, Openly now, confidently, because he knows I'm weak. Took 3 months of drowning in problems I don't know how to solve, of realizing that every successful moment of my rule was actually you, working in shadows I never bothered to illuminate. He moved closer. Not quite pleading, but close. I need you to come back. You need me. I let the words sit between us. But do you see me? The question broke something in his face. I do now. God help me, I do now. But it's too late, isn't it? I spent 6 years taking you for granted. 6 years letting you be invisible while you held everything I loved together. And now you're asking me to prove I've changed, and I don't know how to do that except, he stopped. Except to give you what I should have given you the first time. What's that? A choice. He straightened, and I watched him pull on something that looked almost like courage. Come back. Not as the gardener's daughter. Not as invisible labor. Come back as my equal. As the strategist who kept my kingdom alive when I couldn't see what was breaking. Come back, and I'll stand with you when you expose Jaden.
Publicly.
Before the assembled court. No more protection. No more mercy. His voice went raw.
Justice.
The way you asked for the first time. I should have said yes immediately. Should have felt something like triumph. But 6 years of being unseen had taught me to examine offers carefully. And after? I asked. After Jaden falls and the kingdom stabilizes again? What happens to me then? You stay. The answer came, without hesitation. Not in the shadows.
Not as the help.
You stay as what you've always been, the person keeping this from destroying itself. But visible now. Recognized. Valued. Not queen. Not queen, he agreed. You don't need a crown. You never did. You need to be seen, I finished. I need to matter for who I am, not what I do for you. Yes. The word hung in the small apartment. This space I'd tried to make into home, this life I'd tried to build from nothing. It would be so easy to stay here. To let Aiden drown. To let the kingdom fracture and Jaden take the throne he'd murdered for. To finally stop carrying weight that wasn't mine. But my father hadn't died, so I could learn to stop caring. He'd died believing his sacrifice mattered. And maybe it still could. I'll come back, I said. But not for you. Not because you need me. I'm coming back because my father deserves justice. Because the kingdom he died protecting deserves better than being ruled by its own murder. Because I'm tired of letting guilty men win by default. Thank you. I'm not finished. My voice went hard. I come back as your equal. I speak in council. My strategies are presented as mine, not yours. When the kingdom stabilizes, I don't disappear again. I stay, and I'm acknowledged. Not as your savior. As the architect of your survival. He nodded. Didn't even hesitate. And Jaden, I continued. We do this publicly. I present my evidence before the court. You support me. You choose justice even when it's hard. Even when it costs you. You prove you've changed by doing what you should have done the first time I asked. Done. We returned to the palace at midnight, the time when vampire courts truly came alive. I walked through corridors that had been mine in secret for 6 years, but this time Aiden walked beside me instead of ahead. This time when vampires looked at us, they saw 2 people instead of a king and his shadow. The throne room was full. Aiden had called emergency session, something he'd never done in his entire reign. The assembled court looked restless, curious, hungry for whatever crisis had prompted this. Jaden stood near the throne, and the look he gave me was pure venom. He knew, had known the moment I walked back through the gates. Honored families, Aiden began, his voice carrying in the way vampire voices do, designed to be heard. We're here tonight to address a conspiracy. Not foreign. Not external. One that's been rotting this kingdom from within since the night my parents died. I stepped forward, and the court's attention shifted. The gardener's daughter returned. They probably thought I'd been fired, forgotten, irrelevant. They were about to learn otherwise. 6 years ago, I said, my voice steady despite my hammering heart, I overheard Prince Jaden confessing to orchestrating the coup that killed King Sharon and Queen Selena. I've spent the time since gathering proof. The throne room exploded into chaos. But Aiden raised his hand, and centuries of ingrained obedience brought silence.
Let her speak, he said.
And the weight of those 3 words, the public support, the acknowledgement, was everything I'd needed 6 years ago. I presented my evidence. Every letter, every transaction, every witness testimony. Built my case the way I'd been building it in that archive room, except this time the court couldn't look away. This time they had to see. When I finished, the silence was deafening. Jaden didn't even try to deny it. Just stood there, his face carved from rage and something that might have been relief. Like he'd been carrying this secret so long that exposure felt almost like freedom. The law is clear, Aiden said, and his voice only shook a little. Regicide demands execution. The crown demands justice.
He chose.
Finally, when it mattered, he chose truth over comfort. They took Jaden that night. Not private execution, but public trial. Accountability instead of convenient disappearance. And I stood beside Aiden, not behind, not invisible, and watched justice happen the way my father had always believed it would. The kingdom stabilized slowly. Old alliances I'd built were restored. New ones were forged. And this time, when treaties were signed and policies were implemented, my name appeared alongside Aiden's. I didn't become queen.
Didn't need to.
What I needed was simpler and somehow more impossible. I needed to be seen. And finally I was. I think about other women, like me sometimes. Women who held kingdoms together while being told they were beneath notice. Women who walked away from people who needed them but never valued them. We recognize each other in the quiet spaces, in the way we carry ourselves, in the way we refuse to disappear again. If you understood why I left and why I came back on my terms, if something in this story felt like it was speaking directly to you, there are more like this. Stories about women who refuse to stay invisible. But they slip away if you're not watching. And I've learned the hard way that the things worth holding on to are the first things to disappear when you look away. The vampire king thought I was beneath him. It took losing me for him to realize I was his salvation. And maybe that's the lesson. Not about him learning to see me, but about me learning that my worth existed whether he saw it or not. I still wipe blood from thrones sometimes. Still do the invisible work that keeps kingdoms functioning. But now I do it on my own terms. And that makes all the difference.